Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Kristen, for introducing me. Once again, my name is Sherman, and today we'll be talking about collection overload, understanding and managing collection to support threat intelligence analysis. So before we begin, a little bit about me. So I currently work for New York City Cyber Command. It's a relatively new agency within New York City, and we are in charge of securing around 160-some agencies in 5 boroughs, to include securing the infrastructures, critical infrastructures, as well as the livelihood for New York citizens as well as tourists. Before that, I spent a little time in a major financial institution and then a private intelligence vendor. And before that, I actually spent a few years with the US Army. Now, disclaimer, all opinions are my own, not reflective of New York City government or New York City agencies. And lastly, a hat tip to Kristen Dennison, as well as my friend Ken Wolf, who has helped me refine my presentation. All right, so outline. First, I'd like to spend some time to talk about the notion or the myth that is more equals merrier, or in this case, more intelligence means a better understanding of your threat surface, your threat environment, your threat landscape, if you will. Next, I want to do a little dive into the different types of data that we collect and different types of analysis that we do as CTI teams. Next up, what can happen when you overdo your collections? The problems and issues that may arise when you mismanage your collection operations or just overcollect. Lastly, I would like to share some of the best practices that I've came to know, and hopefully by sharing that you guys can apply that to your team when it comes to analysis and assessments. Alrighty. So the myth, more the merrier, right? So there's this common assumption among intelligence practitioners that the goal is to gather as much information as possible to derive a comprehensive picture of the threats and the operating environment, right? Collect all the intels. Just start collecting like Pokemon, just catch them all. But is it really better? Now, I'm sure a lot of you here have come to know Richard J. Hoover. So he was well known for his work on the alternative computing hypothesis, as well as his book on the psychology of intelligence analysis. So let's take like 5 to 10 seconds here and really digest this one quote, and I'll quote him right now. Once an experienced analyst has the minimum information necessary to make an informed judgment, obtaining additional information generally does not improve the accuracy of his or her statements or estimates. Additional information does, however, lead the analyst to become more confident in the judgment to the point of overconfidence. All right, so overconfidence is a major issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I also want to piggyback and say that other issues may arise as well with overcollection and mismanaged collection operations. Let's do a quick dive into different types of data that we collect. And actually, this is sourced from Rob Lee's personal blog, and he actually made a detailed explanation on collection operations. And I highly recommend everybody here to actually check it out. The link's like on the bottom left. But starting from the left side, raw data. So raw data is basically unevaluated data. But most of the time, they're the most fruitful in the sense that it's closer to a source, but it does require a lot of time to process, right? Because you're sifting out the noise. And not all raw data are valued equal, right? Some are perhaps more important to your organization, and some less so. So samples of raw data might include malware samples, your internal logs, firewall, proxy logs, or deep and dark web forum threads, chatters, if you will. Next up, we have exploited data. So these types of data are analyzed by other analysts, perhaps, and may contain selective raw data or technical details that's supporting their analysis, right? This type of data includes malware reports, indicators of compromise that might have some contextual meaning behind that one IP or one domain or URL if you want it. And then moving on to all the way to the right, we have production data. So production data are limited in raw data, or might not even contain any raw data. Most of the time, sources are unverified or have been neglected or obscured, perhaps for sensitivity reasons or just brevity's sake. Usually, production data is for readers' awareness. It might suggest actions or recommendations for mitigation, perhaps. Samples include federal notifications, FBI pins, right? Or DHS CISA alerts. News reports. Name your favorite cybersecurity news site. That's raw production data. Now, going back, this is more of a progress, right? If you look at all the way to the left side, you're looking at higher noise and higher reliability. Higher noise because there's so much out there that it needs to be refined, but also higher reliability because you're closer to a source. Whereas all the way to the right side, you have lower noise, but you have lower reliability because oftentimes the sources are unverified or are not presented to you, but it has been refined by several steps. So keep that in mind when you collect data. Types of analysis. So largely, there are two main types, and they kind of fall on a spectrum. On one end, you have data-driven analysis. And data-driven analysis, the accuracy of data-driven analysis are dependent on the accuracy and completeness of the available data that you have at hand. So example would be, assessing the military combat readiness of a division of country A. So it's very formulaic in the sense that as long as you have that information available, you can somewhat assess perhaps the size of the division, how much training they do, or how much resource they have, and derive an assessment. Now, on the other hand, though, you have what you call conceptually-driven analysis, and this is where I pull my cheat notes. Sorry. So conceptually-driven analysis, there are no neat boundaries. There might be millions or infinite amount of variables that you can pull or pieces of information to derive an assessment. So, the outcome depends at least as much of the conceptual framework of the analyst himself or herself as it does upon the data. So, if two analysts are looking at the same data set, they might derive a very completely different assessment, or perhaps the same assessment, but for very different reasons. So, once again, this is what we usually look into too at CTI, right? For example, what is the probability of APT flying toasters targeting your organization, right? And that itself is a very open-ended question and can be derived from a variable data sets. So now let's talk about some of the issues that may arise from over-collecting or mismanaging your collection operations. Circular reporting. So this has been touched upon Sunday night. It's a huge problem, I think, among CTI shops or just any information collection shops, if you will. And it is whenever a piece of information appears to come from multiple independent sources, but actually, in realistically speaking, it's coming from one. So all the way up north, as an example, you have the original source, right? And this original source is passing on a piece of information to Alice, Bob, and you. Now, you also have perhaps an informal or formal connection with Alice and Bob, and they too pass that information to you, oftentimes obscuring where the original source came from. So now, your final count of that piece of information is 3, but realistically, it's 1. So what does that do? It might skew the value of that piece of information, overinflating it, or as a team, you have to spend extra time to validate and verify that one piece of information, right? And you can imagine as your sort of info-sharing network grows, this can become more and more complex to sift out noise versus signal. So as CTI teams, this is something that we have to be cognizant of and always be wary about. Next up, collection bias. So, the overabundance of information collected, if unchecked, may lead to analysts nitpicking certain evidence or pieces of information that supports their preconceived assumptions, thereby weakening alternative hypotheses, basically, and analysis work, right? So imagine if you were in a buffet in Las Vegas, right? They're famous for that. You're presented hundreds types of dishes, right? But you yourself, you're a fish person. You don't like your beef, your chicken. Now you're there, and all these dishes are presented to you. But more often than not, you're just gonna choose the dishes that you're more, to your taste, right? So it's the same thing with collection. When an analyst is given an insurmountable amount of information, they tend to pick things that go that goes along with their own preconceived assumptions. So we have to be very careful about that. So potential end state, skewed assessments, right? Or missed out critical evidence. Now let's go back to overconfidence a little bit, because this is a very invisible issue, oftentimes that we're not cognizant of, but can cause major issues in the long run. Now, in Richard J. Hewer's book, he actually presented an experiment on horse betting. By the way, you guys should definitely check it out. It's open source, it's free on CIA.gov. I'm sure they won't track you if you download it, but it's really, really, really good book. And I think it's a keystone for any CTI team or shops or anyone who just want to learn to think. So in that experiment itself, 8 experienced bettors were given a list of 88 variables often found in historical race statistics, right? So weight of the horse, the jockey's weight, how often did that horse was placed in first, second, or third, so on and so forth, right? First, these 8 experienced bettors were told to identify the top 5 most important variables within that list, the 88. Then, they were then asked to choose 10, then 20, then 40 variables out of that 88. Next, they were then told to basically place bets on historical and sanitized horse races so they cannot identify which actual race it is, and asked to place the top 5 horses for each of these races, right? And the iterations of the variables that you choose. So first time around, they were only allowed to use 5 variables, then 10, then 20, then 40. Finally, the the bettors were told to self-evaluate their own confidence based on the given variables and their bets. Now, something very interesting happened. So as you see in this graph, I should blow this up. But anyways, the fact is, as you can see, as more items of information were given to them to place bets, the accuracy level did not actually increase. Matter of fact, there was a slight downtick there when they were using items of information around 40, right? But as more items of information was given to them, their self-evaluated confidence level basically saw a major uptick, right? So looking at around 5 items of information, the horse bettors were self-evaluating their own confidence level at around 20%. But as more information were given to them to use, their self-evaluated confidence went up to 32. Now, essentially, what happened here is, as more information was given to them, overconfidence began to creep out. And it's something that, as CTI teams, we often do, right? And this affects both data-driven analysis and conceptually-driven analysis. Sometimes we're given the same list of IPs over and over again, and to us, we may think that it is now validated by different parties. But in truth, we don't know, because sometimes the source of origin is obfuscated, and once again, the end state of the assessment is skewed. Another problem, cognitive overload. Now, when analysts are presented a huge amount of information, most of the time they'll spend a huge amount of time to sift out the noise, right? Because the more information given, the more, if you're diligent, you have to validate these information, the data points. And in the long run, it leads to added stress, indecisiveness, and less effective analysis of decisions. So AKA analysis paralysis, which is a major faux pas, I think, in the CTI community. And that's at the individual level. Now, at the organization level, as your analyst becomes more fatigued, it leads to skewed assessments or erroneous assessments that may lead to your organization implementing the wrong actions to mitigate threats, right? So let's use the recent example, the Iranapalooza, as I like to call it, when we're just bombarded with Iranian information, news, indicators of compromise, if you will, right? So I'm sure a lot of CTI teams during the course of January were on overcharge mode. Suddenly all your info sharing groups, right, be it the ISALs or ISACs, your vendors, or your Twitter buddy, right, social media, they're all bombarding you with lists of potential IOCs. But in it themselves, they haven't validated it yet. And circular reporting comes around, right? So one ISAC might be saying, oh, these lists of IPs from Iran may be a threat. Pass it along to Alice and Bob again. Alice and Bob thought it was interesting, pass it along to you also. So that also leads to overconfidence, and for you as a team, now you have to start validating each and every piece of information that's incoming, leading to fatigue, indecisiveness as well. This is a major problem when it comes down to overcollection and having mismanaged sort of collection operations. With that said, let's talk about some best practices here. So overall, the overall strategy here is to maintain and establish and maintain a minimal viable collection. So in other words, channel your inner Marie Kondo, all right, CTI Marie Kondo, and ask yourself, what sparks joy? Or in this case, what sparks timeliness, accuracy, and relevance, right, when it comes to collection? Now, the overall strategy is applicable for nascent and established CTI teams. First off, you definitely want to base your collection operations on intelligence requirements that you and your stakeholder has established, right? It's very important. If you're collecting information that are not really relevant to the intelligence gaps that your stakeholders have identified, then the value of that information or data points diminishes, and now you're just hoarding more information, leading to perhaps cognitive overload on the analyst side. Next, look internally, right? Make sure that whatever you're collecting on the external sort of data set is complementing your internal collection. So say if you have a very robust proxy or firewall logs, and you're seeing some weird interactions or traffic that's coming from this one IP, you better hope that your external data can help you enrich that, right? And while enriching, you have to make sure that the external data itself is validated, right? It's not just your unknown, like your IP abuse sort of website, if you will. Next, define rigorous source evaluation process. Very important, and I will hash that out in a bit here because we need to make sure that it is repeatable and scalable. And start with minimal external sources. No matter if you're a Fortune 500 company or a small shop or a small organization, start small. Just have one intel vendor, two, or some info sharing groups, right? Don't go all in right away. Like collect, just purchase all the subscriptions you can get, right? Because that will inundate and basically fatigue the analysts and in your collection management. And lastly, whenever you do add new sources to your sort of collection, if you will, always reapply the source evaluation process, right? Because if not, like the puppy over there, 2 years later, it's gonna look like a gigantor, and you're gonna have a lot of problem maintaining or training the puppy. That is not my puppy, by the way. All right, so let's dive a little deeper into source evaluation here. So let's talk about specifically raw and exploited data. And by the way, exploited data can be either on either side because it has myriad types of data sets. But first and foremost, evaluate your sources telemetry. So say you're thinking about purchasing intelligence from a private vendor, and they have this huge database of it. You want to make sure you have to make sure that they're getting their data points from legitimate sources. Perhaps that vendor has a huge endpoint solutions in which they're also capturing from their other clients to provide you a higher fidelity list of data points. 2, make sure that your IOCs are tagged with additional data. So IOCs themselves, without context, as you all have experience, are practically worthless, right? You want to make sure that this IP is perhaps a C2 infrastructure for this one group. And I personally prefer MISP galaxies because it's very nicely categorized. That's just my bias. Lastly, does it complement internal data, right? Once again, that's very important. Don't start collecting things if it doesn't just pair your internal data or enrich it. And by the way, I do recommend watching David Bianco's SANS presentation last year on quality over quantity, determining a CTI detection efficacy. I think it's a very insightful presentation that does help with source evaluation, as well as help you clean up shop in terms of what you're collecting. So hats off to David. So source evaluation, when it comes to production side of data, the more refined side of the data pipeline. So personally, I think appending an admiralty code to all your sources is very important, because what that does is it provides you a baseline whenever you do have to pull data points from that source, right? I know it might be arduous, it might be a little painful sometimes, but whenever you are told to, from your stakeholders, to derive some sort of assessment, you now already have a pre-collected list of all your sort of sources, and you can see their sort of reliability and accuracy, right? Saves you some time from revalidating it. And then every single time you use that one source, update that admiralty code, right? So it's almost like having a Rolodex that you know like your historical sort of relationship with that source. Next, audit the sources of the source, right? You know, just because it might be from, that data set comes from a very popular newspaper does not mean it's always correct. Always ask the question, where are they getting this information from, right? Try to dig as deep as possible. Next, be very wary of on-the-fly collection. What does that mean? Well, so you need to be very cognizant of like collecting while you're analyzing. And this is often a common mistake for more junior analysts because they want to keep absorbing information while they're like assessing. And that can be a sort of problem because now their heads are not just in assessment, but also collection. So that lessens their effort and their actual like efficacy in assessing like whether it is conceptually driven analysis or data-driven analysis. Last, but definitely not least, improve your analysis models. Always, always improve your analysis models. So there's practically a limitation on how much you can improve your collection management. I mean, there's only a few things that you can do to make sure that it's clean and Marie Kondoed, I would like to call it. But in contrast, improving your team's analysis models, training them into, conducting ACH, alternative competing hypotheses, red teaming their own ideas, that has a more fruitful and more rewarding result. Perhaps you can start with an analytical checklist, right? For example, defining the problem first, then generating the hypothesis, then collect the data or collect the information, then go back and then reevaluate these hypotheses and basically select the most likely hypothesis, right? Having a structured analytical model is going to be a lifesaver when it comes down to improving your intelligence products. All right, so key takeaways. Once again, there are different types of data in analysis, right? So we have raw, exploited, production data, and then on the analysis side, you have data-driven analysis, which is more structured, more formulaic, and then on the conceptually driven analysis, which is more variable. There's a lot of variables, and there are no neat boundaries. Next, more data does not equal to better analysis. Does not equate to a better comprehension of your threat, right? Circular reporting is a common issue when left unchecked. Very common to the point where sometimes you don't even know it's happening, right? And can result in overconfidence, collection biases, and cognitive overload. So, best practices include starting with a minimal viable collection plan. So, once again, sum your inner Marie Kondo. Define a repeatable, scalable source evaluation process. And lastly, and if not more important, improve analysis models within the team. All right, well, thank you very much. I know everybody's hangry right now, so let's get some grub. Thank you.